The morning of the Ashwell wedding broke cold and colorless over Derbyshire, and Miss Cecily Vane stood at the edge of the assembly room in a gown that had been altered twice, not by a modiste. By her own hands, at a candle too small for the work, in the lodging house on the Matlock Road where she and her mother had resided since her father's creditors came for everything else. The gown was white, or had been white once. It was ivory now, the color of old letters, and the bodice had been retrimmed with ribbon from a previous season's bonnet, because there was no money for new lace. She knew, the moment she stepped into the assembly room and saw Lady Dorothea Forthright's eyes move over her from hem to collar and then away again, that the ribbon was the wrong choice. She was there because the Ashwell family had once been neighbors to her father. That was the whole of it. She was there because Mrs. Vane had written to Mrs. Ashwell in terms that could not quite be refused, and Mrs. Ashwell, who was a decent woman, had included them in the guest list with the private misery of someone who knows they are performing a charity that will wound the recipient. Cecily knew this. She went. Anyway, the assembly room smelled of candle smoke and hothouse flowers and powder. The chandelier cast everything in amber, and beneath it the ladies moved in their satins, their diamonds refracting the light into a small riot of color, their voices rising and falling in the particular register that signaled they were all watching one another. Watch everyone else. Cecily took a glass of ratafia she did not intend to drink, and found a place near the wall. She had been standing there perhaps 4 minutes when she heard Lady Dorothea Forthright speak behind her left shoulder to a woman she did not see. "That is the Vane girl, lady," Dorothea said, in the voice of a woman describing a piece of furniture she has decided not to purchase. Portionless, of course. The father ruined himself completely. I cannot imagine what Mrs. Ashwell was thinking. Cecily did not turn. She kept her eyes on the dancers and allowed herself one slow breath. She had learned to do this. To absorb the word portionless the way one absorbs a draft of cold air quickly, without letting it show anywhere on the face. She had been absorbing it for 8 months, since the day the solicitor came to the house in Cheshire with his papers and his careful apologetic voice, and the word had entered her life as a permanent condition rather than a temporary embarrassment. She did not know that at the far end of the assembly room, separated from her by 40 feet of parquet floor and 2 sets of dancers, the Earl of Dunmore had just arrived. His name was Alistair Fenn, and he had not wanted to come. He stood in the doorway in a dark coat, his cravat correct, his face arranged in the expression of a man who has long since stopped expecting rooms to contain anything that requires his attention. He was 34 years old and had been the Earl of Dunmore for 3 of those years, since his elder brother Henry died of a fever contracted on the road to Edinburgh, and nothing about the title had yet settled into his bones as belonging to him. He scanned the room in the way of a man performing an obligation, his gaze moving across the assembly with the detached efficiency of someone reading a ledger. Then it stopped. He was not certain, afterward, that he could have explained what stopped it. She was not the most brilliantly dressed woman in the room. She was not, by the season's strict accounting, in any way exceptional. She was standing very still near the wall with a glass she was not drinking, and she was watching the dancers with an expression he could not quite read from this distance, except that it was not the expression of someone enduring the evening. It was the expression of someone choosing to endure it, which was an entirely different thing, and for some reason he could not name, he kept looking. He looked away. He greeted his host. He accepted a glass. He allowed himself to be placed at the table of a county magistrate whose wife wished to discuss her daughter's musical accomplishments, and he listened with a portion of his attention that was always available for such things, while the other portion did not precisely go where he told it. If you have ever watched someone hold themselves quiet in a room that did not want them there, you will understand what he was seeing. Leave a thought in the comments. We will be here when you return. The dancing resumed after supper, and it was during the second set that the moment occurred which would later seem, to those who remembered it, to have been the first visible crack in everything. Cecily had been approached by Mr. Gerald Forthright, Lady Dorothea's eldest son, a large man with the pink confidence of someone accustomed to being found charming. He had asked her to dance with the particular gallantry of a man who expects gratitude, and she had accepted, because refusal would have required explanation, and she was tired of explanations. She was a good dancer. Her mother had insisted on it, in the years before the money went, on the grounds that it cost nothing to learn and might prove useful. Her mother had been right about this, as she had been right about several economical virtues that Cecily had not then valued, and valued considerably now. Mr. Forthright was not a good dancer. He was an enthusiastic one, which is a different thing, and by the third figure he had managed to tread on her twice and to speak across her to a friend at the edge of the floor about a matter entirely unrelated to the dance. Cecily managed the steps and kept her expression pleasant, and thought about whether the lodging-house fire would still be burning when they returned, and whether her mother's cough had worsened in the cold, and whether the 2 shillings remaining in the household account could be made to cover oil through the end of the week. She did not notice, when she turned on the fourth figure, that the Earl of Dunmore was watching from the side of the room. She noticed that he was there. She had noticed his arrival in the peripheral way one notices any significant addition to a room, the slight reorganization of attention that occurs when someone enters who carries a certain quality of standing. She knew his name because Mrs. Ashwell had mentioned it with a particular emphasis that communicated his rank before his person appeared. She did not think he was watching her specifically. People of his station did not, in her experience, watch women in retrimmed gowns, standing near walls. They looked past them, or through them, or not at all. When the set ended, Mr. Forthright deposited her at the edge of the floor with a vague word of thanks and moved immediately toward a cluster of gentlemen near the windows. She did not mind. She was looking for her mother, who she had last seen seated near the fire with Mrs. Ashwell, and she made her way along the room's periphery with the quiet efficiency of someone who has learned to move through crowded spaces without drawing attention. She was halfway to the fireplace when she heard a small sound from behind the curtained alcove near the musicians' gallery, a stifled sound, the kind made by someone who did not wish to be heard. She stopped. It was none of her business. She was a guest, with no standing and no claim on the Ashwell household, and whatever had produced the sound behind the curtain was almost certainly a matter for someone else to resolve. She went in anyway. Behind the curtain, curled on the window seat with her face pressed into her knees, was a girl of perhaps 10 years. She wore the white muslin of a child, brought down briefly to see the dancing, and she was crying in the particular way of a child who has been told not to cry and is trying very hard to comply with the instruction. A small paper flower had been crushed in her hand, the petals crumpled beyond recovery. Cecily sat down beside her without speaking. After a moment the girl said, muffled, "You are not supposed to be in here." "Neither are you," Cecily said. Another silence. Then the girl lifted her face, which was red and wet and furious. "Thomas Ashwell trod on it," she said, with the absolute certainty of someone describing a cardinal injustice. "He said it was stupid, and a baby would make one. And then he trod on it." Cecily looked at the crushed flower. "May I?" The girl handed it over. Cecily turned it carefully in her fingers, smoothing the petals, working the crumpled paper back into something approaching its original shape. It was intricate work, the kind of paper folding that required patience rather than skill, and she attended to it with genuine care while the girl watched in silence. She did not know that the curtain had been pulled back a precise 6 inches. She did not know that a man in a dark coat had seen her sit down and had seen her take the flower and had stood entirely still for 2 minutes, watching a woman with careful hands restore a small thing that no one else had considered worth restoring. Alistair Fenn let the curtain fall. He stood in the noise of the room and felt something move in him that he had not felt in a long time and did not yet know what to call. The flower, when Cecily returned it, was not perfect. The crumples still showed. It was recognizably a flower again. The girl looked at it for a moment, and then looked at Cecily. "You did not ask my name," she said. "I did not need to know it," Cecily said. "Though I would be glad of it, if you wish to tell me, Harriet," the girl said. She paused. "You are not like the others." "No," Cecily agreed. "I am not quite like the others." She found her mother near the fire and spent the remainder of the evening in relative quiet. She did not speak to the Earl of Dunmore. She did not expect to. She did not know that at 10 o'clock, when the Earl was taking his leave of Mr. Ashwell, he had said, in a low voice, "The young woman, in the ivory gown, the one near the fire with the elder lady. Do you know her?" Mr. Ashwell, who was a perceptive man, had said, "That is Miss Vane. Her father was Vane of Cheshire. There were debts. I'm afraid her situation is rather constrained." The Earl had said, "I see," in a tone that gave nothing away. He had then said good night and walked to his carriage in the cold and dark, and not another word about the matter had passed his lips. His steward, Mr. Crow, had noted the quality of the silence that accompanied the Earl home that evening, and Mr. Crow, who had been in the family service for 20 years and had known both brothers, considered it thoughtfully. The next day was a Tuesday, cold and clear, and Cecily rose before her mother to build up the fire and make the calculations that occupied her every morning in the quiet before the household began. The 2 shillings, the oil. The week remaining in the month, the landlady, Mrs. Greer, who was patient but who had her own obligations, and who had twice now extended the terms of their arrangement with a kindness that could not be presumed upon indefinitely. There was also a letter. It had come with the morning post, addressed to her mother with a seal she did not recognize. She set it on the table and did not open it. It was not her letter to open. Mrs. Vane read it twice. Then she set it down and said, with the careful voice she used when she wished not to alarm, "It is from a Mr. Crow. He says he writes on behalf of a gentleman who wishes to make inquiry." She paused. "He says the gentleman in question has a ward, a girl of 10. The ward's governess has recently departed, and the gentleman is in need of a replacement." Cecily looked at the fire. "It is a respectable household," her mother continued. "The terms offered are—" She paused again with a quality of restraint that told Cecily the terms were significant. "Considerably more than the usual rate." "Which gentleman?" Cecily said. Her mother looked at the seal on the letter. "The Earl of Dunmore," she said. Cecily was very still for a moment. Then she said, "I see." She was not certain what it meant. It meant employment, which she needed. It meant a child, which she had managed without difficulty. It meant a household of rank, which she was equipped for by her education, if not by her present circumstances. What it meant beyond these things she did not allow herself to consider, because she had learned in the 8 months since the creditors came that hoping for things beyond what was evident was a way of making the present bearable only at the cost of making it more painful later. She accepted the position. She arrived at Dunmore Park on a Thursday in November, in a hired conveyance that she could not, strictly speaking, afford with the trunk of her respectable clothes and the small wooden box her father had given her the Christmas before he died, which contained his pocket watch, a miniature of him as a young man, and a letter in his handwriting that she had read so many times. She knew every word without needing to look. Dunmore Park was a gray stone house set in flat countryside, larger than she had imagined, with a long avenue of bared elms and a front aspect that caught the winter light in a way that was almost severe. She was met at the door by a housekeeper named Mrs. Gould, who was competent and kind in the manner of women who have managed large establishments for many years and have achieved a settled efficiency that does not require warmth to be genuine. She was not met by the Earl. She did not see him that day or the next. She met Harriet, who recognized her immediately, and in whom the paper flower had produced an apparently permanent attachment. And she began her duties with the quiet thoroughness of someone who understands that the way to keep a position is to perform it. She met the Earl on the 3rd morning in the library. She had not been told the library was his particular territory. It was perhaps something she should have ascertained. She had come in search of a specific atlas for a geography lesson at 7 o'clock, when the household was not yet in full motion, and she had found him there at the writing desk near the fire, with his coat off and his cravat loosened and a pen in his hand, looking at papers. He looked up. She stopped. He said, "Miss Vane," she said. "Forgive me, my lord. I did not know you were here." "I came for an atlas," he said. The atlas is on the second shelf from the bottom far left wall. He said it is a man who knows exactly where everything in his library is located, and then he looked back at his papers in a way that indicated he had finished speaking. She found the atlas. She left. That was their first conversation. It lasted perhaps 40 seconds. The next 10 days contained several such conversations. They were, by any measure, brief. He told her where things were. He asked once whether Harriet had completed the French translation she had been assigned. She told him Harriet had completed it and had additionally produced a second version that she claimed was an improvement. Something moved briefly across his face at that, quickly suppressed. He gave orders in the way of someone accustomed to having them received, without the softening that would indicate he had considered whether she would prefer a request. Come inside. Sit down. Eat something. She heard these not as invitations but as instructions, and received them accordingly. She did not, at this stage, read anything in them beyond the natural expression of rank. She was wrong about this. She would not know she was wrong for some time. Yet the pattern of proximity established itself in the way such things do without announcement, through the accumulation of small moments. He was in the library in the mornings. She came to the library for Harriet's lessons, because Harriet had decided the library was preferable to the schoolroom on the grounds that the fire was larger. He did not object to this arrangement. He continued his work at the writing desk. She continued her lessons at the long table. Harriet, whose sense of propriety was still forming and whose trust in Cecily had become something close to absolute, occasionally addressed questions to the wrong adult and seemed to find nothing unusual in the triangular arrangement this produced. One morning, at the end of November, Harriet said, "Uncle Alistair, Miss Vane says that the reason the Nile floods is not because of the gods, but because of the rains in the mountains far to the south. Is that correct?" He did not look up immediately. He finished the sentence he was writing. Then he said, "Miss Vane is correct. She usually is," Harriet said, with the particular confidence of a child announcing something she considers settled. Cecily was looking at the atlas and was therefore not watching his face when it changed. She missed, entirely, the brief arrested quality that came over his expression at the child's words, the way his pen went still for just a moment before he continued writing. She was aware of him, though, in the way she had become aware of the fire and the light and the particular silence of the house in early morning. She was aware of where he was in the room without looking. She was aware of the occasional shift of his weight in the chair, the sound of a page turning, the moment when the pen stopped and she could feel, from her side of the table, that he had lifted his head. Though she did not know where he was looking, she told herself this was simply the heightened attention one develops in proximity to an employer. This was not precisely a lie. It was not precisely the whole truth either, and her body was not interested in the distinction her mind was drawing. The wound surfaced on a Wednesday afternoon in December in a way she had not expected. Harriet had been asking about the portrait at the end of the gallery, a woman in blue, with the particular Regency elegance of the previous decade, and Cecily had said with care that she did not know who it was. That evening, in the library, with Harriet asleep and the household quiet, she found herself alone with the Earl. For the first time, in a way that was not accounted for by the natural logistics of her position. She had come to return the atlas. He was at the fire. He said without looking up, "Harriet asked you about the portrait." It was not a question. "She did," Cecily said. "Her name was Clara," he said. "She was my brother's wife." He paused. "Henry died 3 years ago. Clara did not long survive him." He paused again, and in the pause was the particular quality of something being held at a precise distance, not suppressed, but managed, the way one manages a candle flame in a draught. "Harriet is their daughter." Cecily stood very still. "I have not been," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "I have found it difficult to know what Harriet requires. I am not," another pause with something almost rueful in it, "equipped for tenderness, it seems." "You are more equipped for it than you believe," she said, before she had decided to say it. He looked up. The room was very quiet. The fire was the only source of light. She met his eyes for precisely the length of time that was honest, and then she looked away, because the alternative was not something she had yet given herself permission to consider. She said, "Good night, my lord," and left the atlas on the chair near the door. She lay awake for a long time that night, listening to the silence of the house, and thought about a man who had lost his brother and his brother's wife in rapid succession and had found himself in possession of a title he had not wanted and a child he did not know how to reach, and who gave orders in the voice of a man who had learned that protection expressed as command was less frightening to receive than protection expressed as feeling. This is the thing about quiet grief. You do not always see it from the outside. What you see is a closed face, a straight back, a voice that does not waver. She had taken it for coldness. It was not coldness. It was a man holding himself together with the only architecture he had left. She thought about this. She thought about her father's miniature in the wooden box. She thought about the letter she knew by heart. She thought about his face when she said, "You are more equipped for it than you believe." She did not sleep easily. The month of December produced several situations which Cecily later identified, looking back as moments when something altered, though she had not named them as such in the moment. There was the afternoon. She caught Harriet attempting to climb the library shelves to retrieve a volume from the highest shelf, and said firmly, "Come down from there at once." And Harriet had said, "Uncle Alistair says the same thing," in a tone of voice that implied she considered this a recommendation rather than a coincidence. There was the evening she was reading to Harriet by the fire when he appeared in the doorway and stood there for a moment without speaking, and she looked up and found him watching, with an expression she could not fully decode, but which contained, she thought, something that was not quite neutrality. There was the morning she found a volume of botanical illustrations left on the schoolroom table, with no indication of who had placed it there. On a day when they had been discussing the specimens visible from the grounds, she did not ask. He did not tell. She became aware gradually, and then with a sudden clarity that was almost uncomfortable, that he was paying attention to what she needed before she had said she needed it. "Come inside. Sit down." The book placed without comment, the fire in the schoolroom, which had previously required requesting, now burning steadily each morning when she arrived. She was not the only one who noticed. The holiday brought visitors to Dunmore Park, as it always did, and among them came Lady Marian Ashgrove, with her daughter, Miss Lavinia Ashgrove, who was everything the season considered correct. Fair-polished, the daughter of a substantial family with a substantial estate, entirely furnished for the role the Earl's position required to be filled. Lady Marian moved through the house with the particular confidence of a woman who has performed the relevant calculation and found it favorable. Miss Lavinia was kind in the way of a young woman who has been taught to be kind to inferiors as a demonstration of character, and who did not quite see any difference between Cecily and the footman at the door. The governess was not invited to dinner. This was usual. She did not particularly wish to be. It was Lady Marian who said it first. In the corridor near the morning room, speaking to the county magistrate's wife, in a tone not quite low enough, a portionless girl with no family to speak of, and a position in service. I cannot imagine she had expectations. One does hear these things. Cecily was on the far side of the door. She heard it clearly. She stood in the corridor for a moment. Then she went to Harriet, who was waiting for her Latin lesson, and sat down at the table and opened the book. "You are very quiet," Harriet said. "I am always quiet," Cecily said. "No, you are not," Harriet said, with the precision of a 10-year-old who pays close attention. "You are usually talking. When you are quiet, it is because something has happened." Cecily looked at the child's face, which was Henry Fenn's face in miniature, the same line of the brow, the same directness in the eyes, and felt something move in her chest that was equal parts grief and gratitude and a love she had not anticipated and could not now imagine being without. "Nothing has happened," she said. "Let us begin." The evening of the Ashwell Christmas gathering was the occasion on which the season delivered its second public verdict. The party was held at the Ashwell House, which was the largest and most fitting venue in the county for such an assembly, and the guests included every family of standing within 20 miles. Cecily went because Mrs. Gould had said quietly, in the way of a woman relaying an instruction that she had not originated, that Miss Harriet wished to attend, and that Miss Vane's presence would be required. She wore the ivory gown again. She had not yet managed another. She was standing with Harriet near the edge of the floor when Lady Dorothea moved past her with two women she did not know, and said, in a carrying voice, "That is the Vane girl. Still portionless, I believe. One sees her everywhere. Tenacious, one might say." The two women with Lady Dorothea looked at Cecily with the brief appraisal of people processing useful social information, and looked away. Harriet beside her said in a clear, carrying voice of her own, "Who was that woman?" "Lady Dorothea," Cecily said, keeping her voice even. "I do not like her," Harriet said. With the absolute moral confidence of a 10-year-old, "You do not need to like her," Cecily said. "You need only be civil." She guided Harriet toward the far side of the room, and did not look back. The Earl arrived an hour after the party began, with Miss Lavinia Ashgrove on his arm, which was the arrangement Lady Marian had engineered with a thoroughness that admitted no interruption. He moved through the room with his usual quality of contained attention, speaking the required sentences, receiving the required responses, performing the evening with the competence of a man who has long understood that performance is sometimes the only honest thing available. Cecily watched, in the peripheral way she had cultivated, and allowed herself nothing. The dark moment arrived near 10 o'clock. She was alone in the small antechamber where the coats were kept, having stepped out to check on Harriet, who had felt briefly unwell, when she heard two voices in the adjacent corridor. One was Lady Marian Ashgrove's. The other, with a particular quality of careful pleasure, was Lady Dorothea's. "A governess," Lady Dorothea said. "Portionless and in service. I do not say the Earl has behaved improperly, mind you. Well, mind. Only that a man in his position would be very foolish indeed." "Very foolish," Lady Marian agreed, in a tone of comfortable certainty. "She has nothing," Lady Dorothea said. "She is nothing. And whatever she imagines, I think she must know it." Cecily stood very still in the antechamber. She did not cry. She had not cried since the solicitor came, and she was not going to cry now. In a borrowed room at a party she had not been invited to in her own right, she breathed, slowly, with the particular quality of a woman choosing what to do next. She would, she decided, collect Harriet. She would make some polite excuse to Mrs. Gould. She would return to Dunmore Park, and she would continue her work, because her work was good, and she did not need anyone's verdict on her worth to know that it was good, and Harriet needed her. And that was enough. She would not think about the Earl. She had no right to think about the Earl. She was still standing in the antechamber, engaged in this quiet act of self-governance, when the door opened. He stood in the doorway, and she could see at once from the set of his face that he had heard. The corridor carried sound badly, and he had clearly been on the far side of the door. He was very still. "Miss Vane," he said. She said, "My lord." She was proud of how even she kept her voice. "Harriet was briefly unwell. I came to fetch a warmer shawl. I believe she is recovered." "I know what Lady Dorothea said," he said. She met his eyes. "I did not ask you to." "No," he agreed. "You did not ask for a great many things." The room was very quiet. She could hear the music from the ballroom, faint and distant. The particular melody of the third set. "I should return to Harriet," she said. "In a moment," he said. He crossed the small room, and she was very aware of the fact that there were perhaps 4 feet between them, and then fewer. He stopped at a distance that was entirely proper, and at the same time, entirely not. "There is a matter I wish to address. If it is about Lady Dorothea," she began. "It is not about Lady Dorothea." He was very close now, and she could see his face with the clarity that proximity produces. And what she saw there was not the closed, careful expression of the library or the dinner table. It was something underneath it, the architecture, underneath the management. It was a man whose hands were very still at his sides, and whose eyes were not still at all. "I wrote to your mother's solicitor this morning," he said. "I also spoke this afternoon to Mr. Crow." He paused. "And I intend, if you permit me, to speak to you." She waited. "I was not looking for this," he said. "I wish I could tell you I was. I think perhaps you deserve a man who looked for it, who arrived, knowing what he wanted. I did not look for it, and I have not been—" He stopped, and she heard in the stop everything the word equipped had not contained when she had used it. "I have not been easy to know. I am aware of that." "You have not been," she agreed carefully. Something moved in his face. Almost. The expression she had seen in the library when Harriet said she is usually correct. "I have not, and I should like the opportunity to improve." He paused again. "If you would allow me to call on you properly, with your mother's knowledge and consent, and to address the matter of your situation with reference to—" He stopped, tried again. "With reference to whether it might be resolved to our mutual satisfaction." She looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was doing something quite independent of her management of the situation. She was aware of the precise distance between his hand and hers, which were both at their sides, and of the warmth of the room despite the cold outside, and of the music still playing. "I should want you to be certain," she said. "I should want it to be a choice, rather than a remedy." "It is a choice," he said. "It has been a choice since the Ashwell Assembly in November, though I did not have the word for it then." She thought about the paper flower. She thought about the botanical illustrations, left without comment. She thought about a man standing in a doorway watching a woman sit down beside a weeping child and saying nothing, and carrying the weight of what he had seen all the way home. She said, "Then you may speak to my mother." His hand moved very slightly, and then stopped. He said, "Thank you, Cecily." It was the first time he had used her given name. It landed exactly as she had not let herself imagine it might. She went back to the ballroom. He followed, a moment later separately, which was correct and proper, and told no one anything at all. He crossed the room at a pace that had a quality of decision in it, and he offered his arm to Miss Harriet Fenn, who took it with the pleased assurance of a child who has already decided she approves of the way things are going. And he guided her toward the side of the room where Mrs. Vane sat in a chair near the fire. And when Lady Marian looked up to find him there, engaged in quiet conversation with a woman of no rank and no portion, and a daughter in service, she saw on his face something she had not accounted for in her calculations. She began recalculating. Lady Dorothea nearby said to her companion barely above a murmur, "I cannot think what he is about." She did not understand yet. She would understand before the evening was done. He said, with the whole room in a position to observe with Miss Lavinia, and Lady Marian at 12 paces, and Lady Dorothea at 15, in a voice that was level and carried precisely as far as it needed to carry. "Mrs. Vane, I should like to call on you tomorrow, if I may. I have a matter of some importance I wish to discuss with you." The room reorganized itself around this sentence the way rooms do when something real has occurred. Mrs. Vane, who was a woman of sense and who had spent 8 months watching her daughter choose dignity over despair, said, "You are very welcome, my lord." And Cecily, standing 2 paces to the side, kept her eyes on the fire and allowed herself, very quietly, to breathe. The morning was the 14th of December, and the carriage arrived at the lodging house on the Matlock Road at dawn. Mrs. Greer had already been paid for the remaining term, a matter Mrs. Vane had been unable to account for until Mr. Crow appeared with the explanation, in the form of a brief business-like note from the Earl, which also contained, notably, a second note for Mrs. Vane alone. The carriage was the Earl of Dunmore's traveling carriage, dark and well-appointed, sent by his instruction for the 2 ladies currently residing at the lodging-house on the Matlock Road, to convey them at their earliest convenience to whatever arrangement suited them best while the relevant formalities were concluded. The driver had instructions to wait as long as was required. There was also a small parcel left on the step, with no identification, which Cecily opened to find a paper flower. Not her father's. Not the one she had restored at the Ashwell Assembly, This one was new, made with careful hands from good paper, the folds precise, the petals gently worked. It was, she thought, not the work of a man accustomed to such things. It was the work of a man who had been paying attention, and had learned, because he decided to learn, and had left the evidence of his learning without any note at all. She held it for a moment. Her mother, who had never been slow to perceive what was true, said nothing. Cecily set the flower in the wooden box beside her father's miniature and closed the lid. The solicitor came 3 days later. The formalities, Mr. Crow had indicated, were not complicated. The matter of the settlements had been addressed with a thoroughness that left the relevant parties in no doubt of the Earl's intentions, and the Earl's intentions, once declared, had the quality of all his sentences. Level specific, not given to revision. Harriet received the news with a composure that lasted precisely until she was alone with Cecily, at which point she produced a comprehensive expression of delight that involved both arms and an entirely undignified noise. "I told you," she said with the satisfaction of someone whose prediction has proved accurate. "I told you you were not like the others." "You were 10 years old," Cecily said. "You should not have been making such assessments." "I was right, though," Harriet said. Cecily could not honestly argue. The wedding was small. It was at the parish church, at the edge of the Dunmore estate, with the stone tower and the yew trees, and a congregation of perhaps 30 people who had been invited rather than assumed. Lady Marian was not among them. Lady Dorothea was not among them. The Ashwells were, because Mrs. Ashwell had written the letter of invitation that began everything, and she sat in the third pew with the expression of a woman whose charity has produced consequences she had not expected but which she finds, on reflection, entirely. Harriet stood very straight at the front of the church because someone had told her she was required to stand very straight, and she was attending to this with the focused intensity she brought to everything she decided to do properly. Cecily walked up the aisle in a new gown. It was not white. It was a deep cream with a silver thread in the weave, and it had been made by a modiste in the town, and it fit her exactly, because she had gone for the fitting herself and had said, with a precision that caused the modiste to nod with professional respect, exactly what she required. She carried a small spray of winter greenery. She had chosen it herself. She did not carry her father's miniature, because the miniature was in the wooden box, which was in the trunk, which would come with her to Dunmore Park. She had read the letter that morning, the one she knew by heart, her father's handwriting on paper that had gone soft with handling, and she had carried the letter's words with her into the church because some things are not left behind, but brought forward. She looked at him, waiting at the altar in a coat that was dark and exactly as she would have expected, his cravat perfectly correct, his face arranged in the particular expression she had learned to read as a man containing something he considered, at this present moment, too large for the architecture he was accustomed to using. He was not, precisely, smiling. He was something that was not quite a smile and was better. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the evening in the antechamber, the evening in the library, all the mornings in the library, before either of them had names for it, as though he was entirely certain of what he saw. The winter deepened into January. Dunmore Park settled into a rhythm that had a new quality in it, one that was not the solitary management of a man doing his duty alone, but something warmer and more specific. The fire in the library burned in the mornings, as it always had. The long table held 2 people at work now when Harriet's lessons were done, and the atlas lived on the same shelf, but it was consulted more frequently. One evening, near the end of January, Cecily opened the wooden box to place the paper flower next to her father's miniature, and found that they sat beside each other in a way that seemed, without any particular ceremony, right. Her husband was at the fire. Harriet was asleep. The house was quiet, with the particular quiet of a place that contains people at rest. She closed the box. He did not look up from his book. He said without looking up, as though continuing a conversation that had perhaps never entirely paused, "You are not like the others, you know." She said, "So I have been told." He turned a page. It was an accurate assessment. She sat down near the fire, and the paper flower was beside her father, and the letter she knew by heart was in her mind, and the house held them both, and that was enough, and it was more than she had allowed herself to imagine, and it was entirely, quietly, what she deserved. Thank you for staying until the end. If Cecily's story moved you, leave a thought below, and if you have not yet found your way here before, we are glad you are with us now.